Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron Zoom Room event. This evening we're talking about the secrets of racing on Sydney Harbour, and we've got what I could only call a star-studded lineup of experts to discuss and perhaps agree and disagree on some of the finer details of sailing on Sydney Harbour. What we'll do is we'll set up with a bit of a description of the major elements of the harbour from a geographic perspective, where the wind flows, where the water flows, and what the various elements are that affect sailing on the harbour. My guests for this evening, Mark Bethwaite, Ian McDiarmid, Richard Lawson, all great sailors, and helping me to corral these guys is John Diakopoulos, who everybody knows and has been helping the club in so many ways for so many years. So if I can get each one of them to come in, Mark and Richard and Ian. Welcome, Mark. Mark has been an Olympic yachtsman, holder of multiple world championships in everything from J24s to lasers. Lasers being the most recent, I suspect, Mark. And Ian McDiarmid, another sail maker and a champion sailor on many occasions, has sailed with Mark from time to time and won some regattas together. Richard Lawson, an icon around the club in terms of, well, so many things, not just sailing. And John Diakopoulos, the old man.
Oh, please.
All right. So, Mark, would you like to say a little bit about sailing on Sydney Harbour and what it means to you?
Thank you, Phil. Well, I've been sailing on Sydney Harbour, man and boy, for about 65 years. And I think I can say honestly, I still have a great passion for it. To my mind, it's one of the two great sailing venues in the world, the other one being Lake Garda. Lake Garda has a minor advantage in being freshwater, so less maintenance after sailing, but also the food and wine is even better than that of the squadron. But Sydney Harbour is still the pick of it. Thanks, Phil.
Macca.
All I can say is Mark doesn't have lunch on the Hellraiser after a race on a Saturday afternoon in making that comment. But Sydney Harbour I love, and we're talking tonight about a nor'easter and a southerly, and my ashes, I want to go, and I've put a latitude and longitude which is a bit east of Bradley's Head. I want it in a flood tide in the spring and a clear sunny day. Thank you very much.
That's a joyful day. Thank you, Macca. Mr. Lawson.
Well, I came to sailing a little bit before these other guys because I've been on this earth a touch longer. But I started in 58, 59 sailing out of the Royal Motor Yacht Club at Rose Bay, which was purely a motorboat club. But I was introduced to sailing through Tony Furs, a pharmacist who was with Sydney Amateur Sailing Club. And that's where I started my career sailing along with Nick Casson. So Nick and I started at the same time. And someone, and I think it was my father or some other wisdom person, said, the way you learn your way around Sydney Harbour at the Sydney Amateur Sailing Club is you follow Cliff Gale around the course. Now, you guys are laughing because earlier you were talking about Bill Gale. I'm now talking about Father Cliff. And Cliff had the reputation for knowing where the tides and everything were. So that's where I started learning about the right place to go on Sydney Harbour. I've loved it ever since, and I've done the absolute majority of my sailing on Sydney Harbour. A little bit of time on Pittwater, probably 5 seasons or so, but the rest on Sydney Harbour.
Thanks, Richard. So, John, a little bit from you as well.
Well, I guess my Sydney Harbour sailing started in 1960, actually, when we moved from Gosford to the eastern suburbs. And I've been sailing on the harbour ever since. I have to say, I didn't really understand the harbour until I had to start sailing against people like Chock Winning, who was brilliant at being able to pick the wind and tide. And I have to say that sailing against him in the Sollings was probably the start of my understanding that it wasn't just a flat surface that you sailed on. It was a surface that had many, many moods and different ways of being looked at. Anyway, I'm still learning.
Exactly.
Thanks, John. So let's just talk about this run of water that we all love and sail on. I mean, it's challenging. It's one of the most beautiful harbours in the world, as I think Mark has said. And I think when Arthur Phillips first sailed into the harbour, there was comments from, and I'll get the quotes wrong, but it was to the effect that you could anchor 100 ships of the line could anchor safely within Sydney Harbour. And I think there's probably more than that you could have put in there. But nevertheless, it was an amazing harbour for those who sailed into it back in with the first fleet, and nothing has changed since. Although I think the Americans tried to take a little bit out of the sow and pigs during the Second World War, but you know, they didn't take it all out. So let's just talk about the major elements of the harbour. The harbour generally runs in a northeasterly, northeast-southwest run. And thinking about it, there's Parramatta River that runs down through the main harbour and then does a left-hand turn at Bradley's Head. So you get this major amount of water that's running down from the headwaters of the Parramatta River each tide, and then has to suddenly change direction. And there's all sorts of little bits and pieces that push it around in funny ways. Shark Island's very interesting in that because it sort of divides the tide at that point. Bradley's Head also sits on the inside corner, and of course is the quieter corner, if you like. But nevertheless, there's a lot of water that hits Bradley's Head as well. And then, of course, you've got the quieter parts up along the western shore. You've got Chowder Head, you've got George's Head and Middle Head, and then sitting right in the middle, we've got this slightly shallow piece that runs from the Sow and Pigs. On the eastern side, Shark Island, of course, and then you've got the channel that goes down into Rose Bay from the eastern channel. And there's a fair bit of water that moves in and out of that as well, because that can really influence which way you're going to go. And then Steel Point, which is where that water meets the main run of tide again. And South Head and the eastern channel and the western channel, both of which, you know, are major arteries of the harbour. And then if you're part of the divisions that cross the heads and have to go to Manly, you've got the Sound in the centre there. And of course, that's being affected by the water coming out of Middle Harbour. And then you get across that and you're into the main northern part of the harbour, the North Harbour there. North Harbour doesn't have as much water moving around, but nevertheless, there are some interesting points in it. So look, having set that up and thinking of the way that the water runs, let's think a little bit about the way the wind runs. In a nor'easter, of course, the nor'easter blows pretty much straight down the harbour, but if you think about it, North Head sits out there as a great big obstruction to that wind coming in off the ocean. And you get all sorts of interesting eddies and things happening down to leeward of North Head. And that runs out that continues to affect the wind for quite some distance out into the Sound. As you get onto the western side, of course, of North Harbour, North Head doesn't have so much influence because you've got Manly there, which is very low lying, and the wind from the north comes straight across that isthmus and keeps blasting straight down the main part of the western part of the North Harbour. Suddenly then, what happens? Well, you've got that dip, which is from Rose Bay through to Bondi, which is a bit like the Manly dip. But then to the east of that, you've got the heights of Dover Heights, and all of that part of the headlands that impact and funnel the wind and create eddies around them. And then, of course, you've got Bellevue Hill, which creates a great big block to the wind. So you've got
a lot of hot air at Bellevue Hill.
You've got all these different influences that affect the way the wind and the water works. And that's the water that we sail on every week. And every week it creates a lot of different points there. We've also got boats that are going up and down, and ferries and ships coming in and out, which will influence you from time to time. But let's now get and think about what's the way that we sail these races. And to start with, we'll look at a northeaster. And the way we want to run this is take a starting line from where the normal start is and think about how we move up the harbour and what the influences are as we progress. So, John, why don't you kick it off with setting the scenes and asking the questions?
Okay, this is for Mark and Ian and Richard. We've got a nor'easter, about 10 or 12 knots at about 1 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. We know it's going to get stronger during the course of the afternoon. And we've got an outgoing tide. And we're starting at Clark Island. And we're going up to, from Mark's point of view and Richard's point of view, we're going up to Lady Bay. From Macca's point of view, we're going up to Manly, or up to North Harbour, I should say. What would be your preferred route in, say, 10 to 12 knots of nor'easter, knowing it's going to get stronger and it's an ebb tide on a Saturday afternoon? Mark?
Okay, thank you, John. Well, look, I think it's important to start with what I call known knowns. And a known known is that when the sun comes up on a Saturday morning, the squadron will, once COVID regulations are behind us, run races for us. So that's a known known. The other thing that is known is that there are wind bends around various points. So just to take the first part of the nor'easter, John, you said an ebb tide. So
well, I did say an ebb tide, but maybe you want to talk to both tides. But
okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me start with the flood tide because that's where my notes go. But the strategy off the line is well worn. If you're looking for secrets, it's perhaps a very poorly kept secret. The best thing to do in a nor'easter with a flood tide is to win the start at the pin end, sail fast to Bradley's Head, use the wind bend at Bradley's. At that point, you're in a shallower section of the harbour. You are using the wind bend coming in on starboard. You should be lifted at about, if you get it right, you can tack right on the point and then be lifted out on port tack. So that really accounts for the first and really most critical part of a nor'east wind course. If you're racing natural or something similar, I'll pause there, John.
Yeah, thank you. To do that in a flood tide, to get out of the tide, you've really got to go close to Bradley's, haven't you?
Yes. The idea is to cross the tide the minimum number of times. So you have to cross it once to get to the western side of the harbour. And then, of course, you have to cross it again to get back to either the Beeshore Buoy, that's a half cross, or through to Lady Bay.
Okay, take us up to the next stage.
Okay, so you have a wind bend around, a known is the wind bend around Bradley's, around Chowder, and around George's heads. And also when you get across to the other side around Green Point. So my approach in a flood tide is, having got around Bradley's, you may be 100 metres or so, 50 to 100 metres off Bradley's as you exit Bradley's on starboard tack. You can hold that starboard tack on or to the west of the line between Bradley's and George's head for some time. Don't go too close to Bradley's, because another known is not only the lee to leeward of a large landmass, but also the wind cushion on the windward side. So not too far, not too deep into Taylor Bay. I think the line between Bradley's and Chowder Head is a good approximation.
Yeah, you'd probably go as far as not to be able to see around the back of Bradley's. If you can't see around the back of Bradley's, I suppose you're out of the tide, aren't you?
Yes, substantially, and there is a tidal eddy.
Out of the channel.
Yeah.
Yes, there is a tidal eddy in Taylor Bay in a strong flood tide. That is shown on current charts of Sydney Harbour. But to get the maximum out of it, to my mind, you have to go too far to the west, too close to the shore.
Right.
So there's a happy medium here. Wind is always more important than current. Staying in the strongest possible wind should be our objective, right up to about 20 knots of wind.
Okay. Can I bring Richard in there? Richard?
I was just going to say, one of the overriding factors, of course, is what is the tide of the day. So that goes back to before you get on the boat. What is the breeze likely to do, and what is the tide going to do, and what is the difference between the high tide and low tide? If it's nearly a 2 metre tide, then tide becomes a really critical factor, particularly if the pressure's down a bit. However, if you've only got a metre difference in tide and the pressure is reasonable, then Mark's right. You must go with the wind pressure more than the tide.
Right. But tide is always important, isn't it? Doesn't matter.
Well, I think it's
small tide or a big tide.
I think it's a factor that you have to always consider. But I think the difference in high to low tide is really a factor in your race time. And that's the way my way I take it in is, I look at the difference of tide before I leave, knowing where I'm going to be at that time of the day, and to how much emphasis do I have to put on the tide.
Okay, Macca,
Yeah.
bringing you in. We've got as far as Bradley's Head, and you're headed up to the North Harbour in Division 1. Where do you go from there?
Okay, I'd like to add one thing to the tide so we're not confusing people who are watching this.
Right.
If you have a look at a good chart, the tide flows strongest in the deep part of the water.
Yep.
And that gives you a really good clue to map in your mind or on a squadron chartlet just roughly where you should go or could go, depending on a lot of other problems, and that is traffic. And there was a very good 5.5 sailor who said there's nothing like good clean fuel. And keeping your gas clear as you get away and get to Bradley's, and planning when to tack at Bradley's to get moving, especially, Mark, in the mixed divisions that we sail in,
Yes.
where we've got some much faster boats and a few slower boats. It's pretty important. So from there on, I tend to favour, if it is a flood tide, I like that eastern shore, and I don't mind getting in a little bit further.
Sorry,
the western shore. Sorry, John, the western shore. And I don't mind going a bit further than Mark suggested, because generally you find there's less traffic and the water's a bit flatter. So it's easier to keep your boat speed up in that area as you go up there. There's Chowder Head. That's a spot that Mark and I, the very first time we ever raced against, we bumped the rocks there at quite high speed once, I think, in a soling. So we know very much where that little shelf is, but everyone should be aware of that shelf. It can be a terrible bit of excitement. And from there on, shuffle my way up in the shallows, up inside Middle Head, and then with the flood tide, go past Middle Head a bit, not too close, or the wind going up over the land can leave you in a lot of dead air and a lot of bumpy water too. You need to be a bit off there, a bit off being, 50 meters would be a nice distance generally. And then plug your way across to North Head as best you can, with the tide underneath you, giving you a little bit more grunt and a bit more apparent wind.
So you're on port tack in effect.
Yeah, leave there on port tack and get across to wherever, and just work the shifts.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Back to Mark, if we don't mind. Mark, you're a Chowder. You've got as far as Chowder, and you've still got to get to Lady Bay.
Okay.
What's your game plan?
So
Leaving
I
everything
think Ian,
else aside.
so I think Ian and I are on the same page, really, as far as George's Head. We take the Windbend around Chowder, again, approach on starboard, and be lifted in tack to port and be lifted on the exit, and then probably a couple more tacks to stay inside or on or inside the line between Charter and George's Head, not too far in, but not out in the Western Channel. As Ian said, that's where the tide runs strongest. So we take the Windbend off George's Head, and then we say goodbye to the western side of the harbour, which, to my mind, in a flood tide and a true nor'easter is the fastest track. So we leave George's Head on port. We sail across towards Watson's Bay. There is a tidal lee as you approach what I call the middle ground, which is the shallower water between the western and eastern channels. And of course, with Sow and Pigs being an exposed reef, the tide is lesser on the tidal lee, in other words, the southern side of it in a nor'easter. If you need to hitch up a bit to windward to aim into Green Point, which is the headland between Watson's Bay and Camp Cove, do so in that tidal lee, and then head across to Green Point and use the wind bend around Green Point, this time approaching on port, being lifted in and tacking to starboard and being lifted out. I'll pause there, John.
That's okay. Richard?
Yeah, well, I'd support all that. I don't have any issue with any of that. Certainly using the lee tide under the Sow and Pigs it's not very big, but it's still an advantage to use.
Yeah. Yeah, I always find that Green Point, that is the point between Watson's Bay and Camp Cove, that's a tricky one quite often, especially when the breeze is a bit light. Have you guys got any views on how you treat Green Point? Mark?
It's all about observation. As you approach it, looking at other boats in your own fleet, if they happen to be ahead of you, or other boats in other fleets, is always valuable to determine where the wind is blowing strongest and also what sort of angles they're making going in. There's one caveat to that. If they're boats in different fleets, beware of clunkers, because clunkers simply won't point as an Etchell or as Ian's Hellraiser will. But observation is absolutely critical on your way up.
Right. Okay. Richard?
It also depends a bit whether the breeze is in slightly north or it's slightly east, because you go into Green Point there and the breeze is east, it can get a bit funky. Yes. So you've got to really stay in the pressure.
The pressure, agreed.
And that gets back to what Mark says, observation, coming in, watching what's going on ahead of you. It's the old thing, isn't it? The old adage, eyes out of the boat.
Yep, sure is.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for that, Richard. Now, Macca, you're in North Harbour and you're going for the Manly West Mark.
Okay.
In that same nor'easter.
I've left Middle Head. It's a flood tide. I've sailed across to a position that I think is not on a ley line. Always stay under a ley line, because as you tack onto starboard and lay up into that North Harbour area, you can really, using a term I've used a lot, grovel into the gusts. As the gusts come through, and they have a lot of east in them at times, look at them. Sometimes they hit you, you know it's going to be a header, but out the back of that, it's going to be a massive lift. And we're talking 20, 25 degrees at times up there. And really set the boat up to just average your speed up and go high and get yourself right up into the Manly West, Manly East marks. And the key part is you'll lift all the way to generally within 250 meters, 200 meters of the Manly West mark. And then it'll knock like a mongrel all the way to the end. So you need to be a bit overcooked, a little bit high on your ley line as you approach that mark to get there comfortably. And you can always lay a bit of pace on if you have to.
Okay. Now, unless Phil's got anything to add here, what I was going to do was going to take you guys to, you're at your windward mark and you're coming downhill, downwind.
Excuse me, Richard, you had a...
Sorry,
just a very simple thing. I just had a note put under my nose. Perhaps we should explain in very simple terms, ebb tide and flood tide.
Floods coming in.
Watching us, perhaps not as aware. So a flood tide is an incoming tide, an ebb tide is an outgoing tide. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Okay.
I'll jump in here a bit, John. One of the things that I think we need to do is we're pushed for time, so we need to push a little faster.
Okay. All right then. All right. We're at our windward marks and we're going downhill. Now, a lot of people treat downhill as time to have a drink and what have you. But in actual fact, and I remember Mark Bethwaite telling me this about 30 years ago, races are won downhill or downwind, if you like. And so, Mark, from Lady Bay down to, say, down to Garden Island, and it's a flood tide.
Okay. In that same flood tide, once you're around Lady Bay, spinnaker set, stay in the eastern channel and use the flood tide behind you. But the critical thing is to watch out behind for gusts and keep the boat in the maximum pressure possible. The Mark Bethwaite rule for winning yacht races is sail in the greatest wind possible. By the time you get down to Bradley's, you've crossed the middle ground. Don't spend a lot of time in that middle ground. Cross over to the western channel, where, as Ian has pointed out, the tide is running strongest. Once you pass Bradley's, then you're headed for Garden Island. There's really nothing more to be said.
Yeah. Okay.
Just a simple definition. The water runs faster in the deepest part of the harbour. It runs slower in the shallower part of the harbour. So the western channel and the eastern channel are the two deepest parts of the harbour, and that's where you must maximise your tidal use.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, now, we're running. Can we run downwind from the same mark in an ebb tide, Mark?
Okay, in the ebb tide, what I'd be doing is having set the spinnaker at Lady Bay. I'd run down very close to the Sound Peaks and then come across into the shallowest part of the harbour, the middle ground between west and east channels, stay in that mid-ground, heading roughly for Point Piper Double Bay for probably a kilometre, maybe most of half the distance from there to Bradley's, and then come across, perhaps if you're on starboard jibe, come across at a fairly fast angle to cross the western channel, which is now adverse in an ebb tide, and then come down the line, well, perhaps come to within a couple of 100 metres of George's Head, and then run down to shave Bradley's.
Right. And Richard, you do the same thing?
I agree with that. Staying in the quiet water to the western side of the western channel. Cross the western channel as quick as you can, particularly in light air, and get across into that still water, which is on the western side of the western channel, and just go into Chowder, then into Taylor Bay. It's amazing how you can chase the gusts down off those points and stay out of the tide until you hit Bradley's, and then you've got to make the decision to cross the tide at Bradley's as quickly as you possibly can.
Yeah, just find the fastest way out of Bradley's. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Macca?
And if I can add to that, generally over there, there's better breeze too in a nor'easter.
Yeah.
You get better breeze in there on the shores. It sort of tends to accelerate a little bit. You might have to put a couple of jibes in to stay out of the current, but we're talking about, between an average at least of a knot of boat speed gained by doing that. So I agree totally what everyone's saying.
So really, all you've got to do is be prepared to jibe a few times rather than try and sail straight downwind.
And as Mark said, when you sail downwind, your eyes have got to be in the back of your head. Stay in the pressure.
Yeah.
Stay in the
that's one of the big things coming down from Manly East is you get into that Western Channel, and then if it's an ebb tide, you're quickly looking to duck into Obelisk, and as
Yep.
says, many jibes, little jibes in and out of there to stay, and you come out around George's Head, back again into Chowder. It's dodging that main channel that's knocking you straight in the nose.
Yeah.
And many races have been won and time's been improved by just ducking in there and staying out of the tide. You've got to be good at jibing the boat. And Macca, this is where it's a bit different to you. You've got to decide whether you've got your ASO up or your symmetric.
Oh, well, in these conditions, we wouldn't have the asymmetric up. It's just straight running.
Yeah.
Be just symmetric.
By the way, Mark, it wasn't 30 years ago you told me that. It was over 40 years ago. It's scary, fellows.
Yeah.
Okay. We've rushed the downwind leg, which we shouldn't do, but we have, because we've also got to talk about the southerly course. Most southerlies.
Can I just quickly add?
Yes, sure.
That Western Shore, where you see that demonstrated more than anything else, is with our actual fleet. I mean, it's the most competitive fleet on the harbour at the present time, probably bar Mark's lasers over Double Bay. But you get 20 Etchels going, and you will find they go around their weather mark, which will be up mid-channel, and they'll immediately go on a 3/4 run, so to speak, straight across into Chowder. And then you'll have 20 Etchels ducking and weaving all the way down around and into Taylor Bay, all the way down that shore to Bradley's. You know, it's really, I mean, I've done a lot of it, but to watch it is just fascinating how close the boats sail together, but they're all doing the same thing. It's just trying to keep out of that tide in the Western Channel with an ebb tide.
You're absolutely right. And you think they're going the wrong way, don't you? But in actual fact, they're going the right way.
Yeah.
Sometimes the long way is the right way on the harbour, and they know which way to go.
Yeah.
And we used to do that in the Sollings a long time ago.
Well, one design fleet showed that more than anything else.
That's right. Okay, so we go into the southerly course.
Could I just say, before we close off on the nor'easter, I think there's a golden rule here. If as Ian and Richard, I think, have pointed out, in a true nor'easter, the wind, because it has to bend around those headlands, tends to be accelerated. There tends to be more wind on the left-hand side of the harbour. The left-hand side of the harbour is the golden rule for a true nor'easter, or if there's a touch of north in it, if it's prefrontal. However, the game changes if the wind is east of north. If the wind is east of north, you go to the eastern side of the harbour, even in a flood tide. And so the paradigm changes. You win the start at the weather end at the boat end of the line, and before long you tack towards Rose Bay, and then you stay and then you stay close to the eastern shore, because the breeze funnels out of firstly Rose Bay, Vaucluse / Watson's Bay, and you find yourself lifted on starboard tack to a far greater extent than boats further west of you on the harbour. So those, I think, are two golden rules.
And if I may add something very briefly to that, if the wind's from the east, if it's a southeaster, you hit the southern shore. If it's from the west or the north, you stay on the western shore, and it generally will never let you down there.
Agreed.
Right, it's okay. It's a question of trying to work out when, isn't it? How far east or how far north? Okay. Just I've got to hurry us along a little bit, haven't I? So we're around our southerly course now, and we're starting in Athol, and we're going to Double Bay. Most of the courses go to Double Bay, and then we go down to Obelisk. And Macca, you'd be going on to Manly, but let's say Double Bay and Obelisk. Is there a right way and a wrong way to go between Athol and Double Bay, leaving aside other boats and leaving aside ferries and windships? Is there a general rule one should follow?
Yeah, I'd like to say something, if I may. Look, you've got to look for the easterly ships. You may come off a starting line with the wind coming out of Rushcutters Bay, and you've got to, and they shift around a bit. So coming off your starting line, you're looking for 3 minutes at least from the starting gun down the track. And so starting at maybe an unfavored pin end, knowing that you're going to hit some hard stuff from the left or from the east to be able to tack into that, and then get back across the guys who have gone the other way. Generally, you just got to work those shifts, and they're there and you can see them. It's just a matter of timing and being able to tack when you have to and you want to.
And I fully support that. The one addition I'd make is that in a flood tide, hold that starboard tack for longer because you're in a tidal lee behind Bradley's. If you're in an ebb tide, then hold the tack not as long, come out on port tack and come into that current earlier.
Agreed.
Right, and then does Clark Island come into play?
No, it just gets in the way.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I think on that short beat to Double Bay, you need one big dose of patience. You have to make a decision. I think Mac is right, starting on the pin end. And the easterly shifts will come, but by gosh, at times you've got to be patient. And sometimes you've got to go a long, long way. And suddenly it'll break. And then you come back across the fleet with a 25-degree shift. It's just amazing.
Yes, agreed.
You can look bad and come out good. And that's the sort of thing it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'd like to throw something into the mix here too. And we've all been talking about pin end starts or boat end starts. And typically that's fine if you're in a one design fleet and all the boats are the same size. Having sailed on the smallest boat in Division 1 with the smallest sail area, you've always got to be at the boat end. You've always got to be in the breeze. And the golden rule that Mark was pushing about, you know, the wind is your fuel and sail in the greatest amount of wind is the rule. Otherwise, you end up in a smaller boat with a smaller rig being absolutely knocked out.
Out the back door. Yeah.
And you fall out the back door. So all of these things are fine, provided there's basically parity between boat sizes. But if you're in a smaller boat, you've got to consider what's going to happen to you with your smaller rig.
I think it's called horses for courses.
Yeah, clear air, guys. Try and get it and maintain it if you can.
Clear air is great.
Okay, we've managed to get to Double Bay in a reasonable position, and we're going down to Obelisk, and it's blowing from the south, and it's blowing somewhere between 15 and 20 knots. Any ideas of what one ought to do other than not broach?
Genuflect 3 times, rattle the rosaries. It's a real problem because you can sail a two-legged, a two-sail reach there for a little while and put a small chute on, your littlest spinnaker on, or an asymmetric or anything, and you can end up half right and half wrong. But if there's any pressure, if you get a bit of east in it, you're in a lot of trouble. As we did one day, and we had a problem with 2 bloody big ships on our lee bow. So, yeah, it'd be an issue. Sorry, I can't answer your question on that, John.
That's okay. But you don't over worry about the tide. You just sail your boat.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yep.
I think in that pressure, you've just got to sail the gusts. You've got to have someone looking at the gust all the time. But once again, coming back to one design, because they're the best ones that tell you long term over many, many races. That's something generally mine would be every time you got a gust, go with it, bear away, go with it. And if anything, sail deep all the way down there, because by the time you get down to a chowder, invariably the breeze will go right.
Yep.
It'll go more around
behind you. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
You'll
go behind you, and in effect you get lifted out of Chowder Bay. So whether you're going to Chowder or whether you're going to go to Obelisk, I still believe long term that leg requires a lot of patience, sailing deep, and in the end it will all pay off at the bottom end.
Right.
Yep.
And avoiding those shelves off those points.
Yeah, been there, done that one.
Time.
So just keep your boat on its feet.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the most critical thing.
So we've managed to get to Obelisk, and we're now coming back we're sailing back up the harbour to Rose Bay. Okay. Let's take a flood tide. Mark?
Okay, my golden rule there is that in a true southerly, come back up, take the Windbend, approach on port to George's height, George's head, approach on port, depart on starboard, flood tide, probably work the western, flood tide, stay in the western channel, stay in as much tide as you can, but work the western side of the harbour. If the breeze, as it is at all in the east, so south-southeast, then irrespective of the tide, work the eastern side of the harbour. And the only headland really available to you there is Steel Point. Forget George's head. You pay too great a penalty. Can I just give one example? Both you and Ian McDiarmid were on our J24 in the 1982 World Championships. I know that's before many people in the audience were born, but the harbour hasn't changed and the breeze hasn't changed a lot. There was a very long starting line set off George's head, and we figured out, and a strong ebb tide, run-out tide. We figured out that that if you started at the pin end, even if the boat end was favoured, which it wasn't, let's say it was an even line, you'd done most of the tidal cross before the rest of the fleet had even started. So that was a classic case of starting in the middle of the harbour and going left, going to the eastern side of the harbour, working your way up around Nielsen Park, and then using the Steel Point bend. And as Ian and John will know, in a fleet of about 70 J24s, we did that. We rounded the first mark, perhaps 100 metres in front, won by 5 minutes.
Yes, I'll never forget it. Could we?
And it was blowing dogs off chains.
Okay, so that's, if there's any east in the southerly, that's what you do. You go to the eastern shore.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
Steel Point is something that Billy Gale talks about a lot, but Billy's not with us tonight, but he says that the ebb tide really rushes around Steel Point out of Rose Bay.
Yep.
So if the tide is ebbing and you're sailing in a southerly and you're going into Rose Bay, how do you treat Steel Point?
Well, the known is that you get a wind bend, therefore you can get an advantage coming in on starboard and exiting on port, albeit that there is current there, that is adverse current, but you then either have the choice of proceeding up the Hermitage Bay side, in other words, the northern shore of Rose Bay, or crossing to Shark Island. And to my mind, that is really dictated firstly by wind strength, and you get that by observation, and secondly by wind shifts, again by observation, but by the lived experience on the boat at the time. I don't think there is a golden rule for that sector between Steel Point and where the squadron lays the mark up in the middle of Rose Bay. I think you've got to live on your wits going up there.
Right, okay. Because the breeze shifts a lot too, doesn't it, going up there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Richard, any
Yeah,
idea?
I tend to agree. I think current's not the critical thing. I think it is the shifts in the breeze. If there's any south in the breeze, certainly a leg back to Shark Island and work up the Shark Island shore is really a big gain. However, if there's any east in it, certainly go left, because invariably you'll get left shifts all the way up there, and some of them may not come until you're right up near the mark. But once again, they're dramatic shifts in Rose Bay, and they invariably come out of the left if there's any east in the breeze.
And there will be shifts.
Yeah. Can I just take you to another scenario, which is a little unusual, but the One Design classes often round marks down in Chowder Bay and go up into Rose Bay in that breeze. If there's a true southerly and an outgoing tide, an ebb tide, not many people are going to do it, but invariably you sail to the right-hand side of Shark Island, the western side of Shark Island.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it works by big time.
what that does is you leave out the current that's coming around Bradley's head. And for a long time, it doesn't seem to work. But then suddenly, when you think it's not, the tide's not affecting you, you get these gains, you flop over on the starboard tack when you can just lay around Shark Island. And usually it's a bit funky across over there past the Edwards because of the high land of Point Piper. However, it's amazing how many times, if you do it and do it well and with patience, how you'll come out on top of a whole fleet.
Agreed. And I've seen that many times.
You can only do that in an ebb tide, can't you?
Yeah, well, oh yeah, definitely. You have to use the ebb tide coming around Bradley's. That's the whole secret.
Yeah. Okay. Macca, you're coming from Manly.
Yes.
Southerly, back to the main harbour. Are there any important observations that you make from that?
I tend to work the eastern side. In a southerly, even if it's a fairly solid southerly, any shifts you see won't be southwest. They'll always be east. So I like to be on the eastern side. You will end up down towards or even below Middlehead, and just pick a shift. There's always a lot of gas coming, a lot of air coming around Middlehead. You can pick up a nice one and get across the harbour. And from Middlehead, you're not banging the seaway to get in the waves that are coming basically square across you. And so you can get a much easier run and get out of that bad seaway. So I like to get to Middlehead. So you'd come around the mark at Manly East, you'd go to the shore, you'd tack, you'd go up the shore there for a while, then you slowly get headed across. You would take whatever tide there is, get to Middlehead somewhere, tack in a shift and pressure, and get the hell across the harbour. And generally, you're not banging into a seaway. And I think that's the best way to do it.
Okay. All right. Phil, any comments from you?
No, I can't add anything to what these guys have got to say.
Okay. Any general comments from you, Mark?
I was going to make the point that Richard made about the in a southeast course, if the start is in Chowder or even sometimes in Taylor Bay, going to the south of Shark Island, the tide, if you look at a current chart, as you said in your intro, Phil, there is a massive water coming out of the Parramatta River running from the west to the east. It must turn left at Bradley's, but Shark Island does tend to split that current. Instead of just deflecting it west, current does pass between Willara Point, which is Point Piper, and Shark Island. It curves around the eastern side of Shark Island, and that's what gives rise to that current that you mentioned earlier, John, off Steel Point, that ebb tide current running from, at that point, southeast to northwest. So that is a feature of an ebb tide. Again, if you look at the same current charts and the ebb and the lived experience is the same, in a flood tide, there is not the same body of water going into Rose Bay as there is in an ebb tide. So the reverse, if you like, doesn't work so well. The flood tide tends not to rotate around the eastern side of Shark Island.
Right. Okay. That's interesting, isn't it?
Throw something in there. Just a bit of terminology that perhaps many people might not understand. Mark, you talk a lot about Windbend, and I think we all understand that. But can you just describe in a little bit more detail what Windbend is and what you mean by Windbend?
Okay. You don't need a PhD in thermodynamics to know that wind will tend to bend in the horizontal sense rather than rise in the vertical sense. So take any headland in the harbour, and we've talked about a lot of them, Bradley's Head, Chowder Head, George's Head, Middlehead, Steel Point. If the wind is blowing along, say, the western shore, and let's take Chowder Head because it's a nice round headland, then the wind will tend to follow the shore. The primary wind direction is northeast to southwest, but as the wind, if you imagine yourself as a piece of wind approaching George's head, you will turn left as you approach the head, straighten up as you go past the head, and then turn right into Taylor Bay as you pass the head to rejoin your friends who have been to the right of you, and you've been compressed against your friends, other particles of air to the left of you. That is a wind bend.
Thank you. That's a great explanation, I think.
Okay. Well, we've probably reached the end of our southerly course and the end of our northeast course. Now, Richard, have you got any general comments?
Well, I was just going to say, can I just take you to another part of the harbour that affects Friday night racing, which is from the Squadron to Clark Island. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, why not?
Yes.
Okay. Because now on Friday nights, we're starting from a starting line. In a sou'easter, invariably, we're getting a starting line at right angles to the breeze. And this is different to what we've had for many, many years. I think it's improved the quality of the racing enormously, and it's all putting pressure on the rules. So people need to brush up on their rules for Friday night. However, you start on the starting line in a sou'easter, and we had a lot of this last season, that if you have an ebb tide, an outgoing tide, there are big gains to be made at Fort Denison. So if you can start at the boat and then tack onto port tack at the right time, so you lay basically directly at Fort Denison, not underlay it, not overlay it. So ideally tack so you're going to hit Fort Denison right in the middle. Invariably then there's this great elevator that comes down the Parramatta River, goes round Fort Denison, this bloody rock that sits up there in the middle of the harbour, and the water has to bend round either side of it. And there's a real elevator effect on the northern side of Fort Denison. Get into that, and invariably if you play it, your cards right, that'll take you up further to windward, just the tide, and it'll take you then towards Garden Island.
And also,
and
Richard, also you have a wind bend at Garden Island, especially with those sheds there. There's always pressure, and there's generally a shift there to get you back across to Naval 2.
So I was just going to say, you take a little bit of a loser to go into Garden Island, you pop over on the starboard tack, and invariably the breeze bends around, as Marcus just said, bends around Garden Island headland, coming out of Rushcutters Bay, and invariably there are right-hand shifts going up there. Now, in an incoming tide, it's a no-no. Don't do it, because it's a down the... It's oblivion if you go that way. You've got to go left, you've got to go towards Bradley's Head in an incoming tide, and then wait for the shifts to come out of the left and then tack across towards our Naval Buoy.
I agree.
And I'll just take a couple of more seconds and say the tactics from rounding Naval Buoy to starting at the Clark Island start line on Saturday are quite different. Because if you go on to starboard in a nor'easter, if you go round Naval Buoy and go onto starboard around Naval Buoy, you are then underlaying Bradleys, and you get some really funky breezes coming over the top of Bradleys because it is not clear breeze. You need to be more across towards the Point Piper shore and then tack to go to Bradleys. So if you're going to use the outgoing tide going into Bradleys under your bow, then you need to be hitting Bradleys right on the point. And that's the time to tack from your port tack. So you go round Naval Buoy, stay on port tack. When you think you can lay right on the point of Bradleys, flop over on the starboard, and invariably you'll pick up the outgoing tide there, or you'll get the shifts bending around Bradley's Point. So it's just another part of the harbour that comes into play on Friday nights, and people don't think about it because they're too busy having a wine. But to me, it's critical.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. That is a part of the harbour that we don't pay any attention to, except when we try to sail maybe an easterly. But then we don't pay enough attention to it because we don't know enough about it. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks very much, actually. Phil, back to you.
Well, look, we've got about 4 more minutes until we're finished, and we haven't had a lot of questions. I mean, the wind Windbend was one question that has come in, and Mark's explained that very well. So we've got a bit of time left. Are there any other issues that you think are relevant to racing on the harbour, and be it Saturday racing or the Friday night twilights? Mark, I'll start with you and then go round.
Okay, I'll just come back to the golden rules that I mentioned earlier, and that is to tend to favour the windward side of the harbour. So in a nor'easter, if it's a true nor'east or tending north, if it's prefrontal, then the windward side of the harbour is the western side. Favour the western side. If the wind is east northeast, favour the eastern side. Similarly, in a southerly, I think all of us have said the same thing. There are generally better shifts coming off the eastern side of the harbour in a southerly because of the tendency of the wind to come out of Vaucluse Bay and also to come out of Rose Bay, sort of over Shark Island between Point Piper and Steel Point. But one thing we should all be aware of is that the wind after a front comes through, and a front has just come through in the last couple of hours, it's hard in the south now. It may still be in the south tomorrow, but it will back, which means it will go anti-clockwise over time. So it'll tend to go from south to southeast, particularly if there's any thermal heating. And so the wind will back through southeast, spend a little time in the east, and then tend to come in from the north again, then go to a prefrontal northerly, and then a southerly will come in again. That is the classic, just about weekly summer pattern. It might be 5 days, it might be 8 days, but about once every week that happens. Just be aware of that, and be aware that, for instance, if you're sailing in the southerly and it's a warm day, there's only one way the breeze will go, and that's southeast.
Yep.
I'd like to actually, at this point, ask Macca a bit of a question. Have you got any classic stories about sailing on the harbour and nor'easterly and eastern channel, perhaps?
Yeah, I've got one. I made some sails for Dave Porter many years ago, and he stopped sailing 18s and started racing 505s, and we're making some sails for him. And Dave used to call at about 9:30 on a Monday morning and talk about the day's performance and what happened. And he said, "How did I go?" And I was racing a Dragon at the time. And he said, I went left up the last beat. Oh, Macca, he said, I'll tell you a story about that. When I first started racing 18 footers, I did that, and that was with a ebb tide against a nor'easter. The sea breeze always goes back to the east late in the day, and the 18s used to start at 3 o'clock, so it was always late in the day. The breeze goes left, and he said, the first time I did that, I lost first place, and Dick the diver nearly lynched me when I got ashore. And Dick the diver was a bookie on the ferries. And he said, any idiot knows that the wind always goes to the east with a run out tide late in the day. He thought he'd chuck the race, and he was livid. So I'll leave you with that story.
Why was he known as Dick the Diver?
Sorry, Phil?
Why was he known as Dick the Diver?
Oh, he used to be the bookie, illegal bookie on the ferries, and the cops used to do their casual raid once or twice a year. He just stuffed his pockets in his suit, coat and tie and the whole issue full of money, and just went straight over the side, swam it. He was the funniest little bloke you'd ever meet. He was a real character.
Well, look, I'd like to thank all you guys. It's, the amount of knowledge that's been given out this evening is huge. My only concern is going to be that there'll be far too many people sailing right in the middle where we're supposed to be sailing, and for little boats in the division, they're going to run out of wind. So when the golden rule is sail in the greatest wind, that could be a problem. So we're going to have to find another way around when I speak to Davo about that.
Mm.
And I thank everybody for what you've done tonight. Mark, thank you. Ian.
Pleasure.
My pleasure. Mm.
And you know, JD, you've done a fabulous job in putting the questions together. So
I'm trying to learn.
I'm going to say good evening and thank everybody for joining us. Good night from the Zoom room and good night from the squadron.
Good night, all.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you all.
Nice talking.